Hi everybody, and thanks for having me here at the San Diego VMUG. I really enjoyed talking to you earlier today about how our data centers are changing and the technology that's there. But this time, given a little snafu with the cloud, I'll just blame the cloud, I don't have the original presentation. Fortunately, we already have vBrownbag of it. So today I'm going to talk to you about bourbon. Okay, and we're going to do the basics of bourbon. This is very useful for your jobs and in our industry because it's really useful to be able to talk to people and share something and something conversational that is not just strictly the technologies that we deal with. So I'm Josh Atwell. I am a bourbon enthusiast, and we're going to go over what is bourbon, the rules for bourbon, because there are rules. We're going to talk about the ingredients that make up bourbon. We're going to talk about what makes bourbon unique, and some great ways to serve bourbon. Because in the end, as fantastic as bourbon is, the final part of the bourbon journey is the one that goes to your mouth, and that is the best. And yes, I had a presentation on my laptop about bourbon. So, what can I say? So first off, bourbon is an American barrel-aged spirit, okay? It's a whiskey, and it's made primarily from corn, which, if you think about it, is the quintessential American crop, right? We make more corn in this country. It's absolutely ridiculous, right? But the best thing used for corn is bourbon, okay? And there's a really important distinction about bourbon is that it is an exclusively American whiskey or spirit, right? And all bourbon is whiskey. Every single bourbon in the world is whiskey. But not all whiskey is bourbon. So there's some very distinct differences. So here are the rules of bourbon. I wasn't kidding. I have a presentation about bourbon. Rule number one, it must be made in the United States. Now, contrary to popular belief, it does not have to be made in Kentucky. Bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States. Congress dictated that. It is law. Right? And they did that because as bourbon and whiskey was growing in popularity, they looked at distribution and how it was being distributed across the world, and they were concerned about other countries coming in and saying, well, we make bourbon. No, say we, right? So champagne only comes from a region in France. Bourbon only comes from America, and it doesn't have to be Kentucky. Although most would argue the best bourbon comes from Kentucky, and I think 93% of bourbon comes from Kentucky. Rule number two, it must be aged in a white oak barrel. It must be a virgin oak barrel, which means it has to be a barrel that has never been used for aging a spirit or any alcohol or anything ever before. A brand new, net new barrel made out of American white oak. And it has to be charred on the inside. Okay? Now that charring process is really important to help the barrel seal and also to give it more pores and more opportunity to transfer the whiskey in and out of the barrel, because that is how bourbon ages over time. The whiskey is absorbed into the barrel and then pressed back out of the barrel into the solution. It has to be a majority of corn. So 51% of the ingredients used in bourbon to make, or whiskey to make bourbon, has to be corn, so it has to be a minimum of 51%. Must be a majority. Nothing real fancy about that. One thing that's interesting is that all the distillers of bourbon, they source their corn from various different places. And more often than not, especially with the older family distilleries, they have a family farm, some organization or a family that they've dealt with for generations to source their corn. And it's part of what makes their bourbon unique. It must be at a specific proof. Now when you talk about proof, right, that's the alcohol content. So for bourbon, it is deemed by law that it has to go into the barrel at less than 125 proof, right? This keeps distillers from throwing it up really high, aging it, and then watering it down, right, so that they can get more product. So this ensures higher quality. It also means that they cannot put it in the bottle for less than 80 proof. So you will never find a bottle of bourbon that has less than 40% alcohol content. So you take the percent alcohol, double the number, that's how you get your proof, okay? And then finally, the water that's used, because in the end, they do have to cut it. Because over time, as the bourbon ages, there's evaporation. We call that the angel share, okay? All right? What's stuck in the barrel, they call the devil's cut. All right? They got stuff for everything. And you'll notice there's Angel's Envy bourbon, and Jim Beam, I believe, makes a devil's cut whiskey where they found a way to extract it out of the barrels. So when they do cut it and they go to get it down to the proof that they want to have for distribution, they have to use water. That water cannot have any additive to it, no flavor, no color. So most distillers that run, especially at a higher volume, will use reverse osmosis systems, which is really kind of cool to watch, where they remove all possible impurities from the water, okay? Pretty straightforward rules, right? Every single bourbon that's made in America has to follow these rules. There's some additional rules that can be applied for things like bottled in bond. I don't have a slide for it, so I'll just talk through it real quick. With bottled in bond, it has to be aged a certain amount of time, and it has to be bottled at 100 proof, right? So and it has to age in a controlled warehouse. It can't be mixed with other things, right? Most bourbons, a lot of them that you'll find, they'll be considered small batch, where they mix multiple batches of the bourbon together. You'll have single barrel, where it comes directly from a barrel. They may water it to change the proof to what they consider the best taste. But when you're bottled in bond, it has to come from a single season, from a single batch, from a single distillery. So any blending that you do has to happen right there. So the ingredients of bourbon, you got 51% corn, you got malted barley, rye, and wheat. And putting the combination of these together is what they call the mash bill. And the mash bill is how they distinguish one flavor from the other. So the mash bill will create their distinctive flavor based on the grains that they bring in, where they source their grains, how they process their grains, and then even the yeast strain that they choose to use. Right? So this is how they work on making bourbon unique. So their mash bill, the grain formula, some distilleries will actually tell you what their mash bill is. They'll tell you what percentage of corn and barley and rye or wheat that they use. Others keep it a closely guarded secret. And part of the reason for this, like for instance, Four Roses, they'll tell you everything they do with their mash bills because you can't get a hold of their culture, right, for their yeast. And you can't source the material that they source for their grain. So you can't duplicate what they do. Another thing is the char level, how much they char the barrel, right? There's different levels of char. Based on that level of char, changes the way the barrel will absorb the spirit and release the spirit back out. Aging. Time in barrel is typically no less than 2 years. You may see small distillers out there try to do small barrels, aged for a short period of time. Those are typically not considered very good, but moderately interesting. Traditionally, you'll find bourbon will be aged between 4 and 6 years. Most people find 6 years to be, from the mass production standpoint, that nice little sweet spot. I want to caution you, just because a bourbon is aged 13, 15, 18, 20 years does not mean it makes it better. It is not like Scotch. Scotch tends to get much, much better as it ages in the barrel. Bourbon is not necessarily the case. Often you'll find older bourbons taste a little bit woody, like you're licking the inside of a barrel that's been burned. For some reason, And the interesting part about that is in that aging process, part of the reason why older whiskeys cost more is because of the angel share. Because over time, that evaporation leaves less and less in the barrel. So they have less and less product. So when you think of something like Elijah Craig 23 or Pappy Van Winkle 20 and 23, part of the reason why they're so expensive is there's so little product out of the original batch. Barrel location is also very important. The barrels are stored and aged in what they call a rick house. And the rick house location, its size, how many layers it has, like how many stories it has, completely can change the characteristics of the bourbon and how it ages. Because in order to get the expansion and contraction, you need contrast in temperature. It's another reason why Kentucky is great for aging bourbon, because it has so many different seasons. They get wide variances in temperature, so they have the opportunity to get a lot more flavor pulled out of the barrel, right? Another thing about the location is humidity. Maybe they'll have rick houses closer to the river, maybe farther away. Buffalo Trace is a great example of this. They have the same mash bill for all their whiskeys, but some they age close to the river, some low, some high, and some, like Blanton single barrel, they age in a metal warehouse. So it has a completely different flavor profile, even though they're made from the exact same white dog, which is that initial distillation that they put in the barrel. Crazy stuff. It's a lot of fun. So when you hear people talking about, I like this whiskey versus this, these are the components. And the master distillers, their big job there is to take all these barrels and either do single barrel or very select small batches, and they'll start blending. So they'll mix barrels that have different profiles. And the interesting thing is that those barrels may not be aged the same amount. You may have 6-year age, 9-year age, but the way the flavor profile works, the distiller says this is the quality product that we want to produce. So, final part, and I'll do this real quick, is the best part about bourbon, and that's consuming the bourbon, right? A lot of different ways to do it. There's neat, no ice. I highly recommend anytime you're trying a new bourbon, you should try it neat. A little bit in the mouth, chew it around a little bit, just let it get all over your palate, try it. Do the second sip as well, and then you've got a really good feel for what that bourbon's going to taste like. Personally, I don't mind throwing ice in there, and I don't judge. We call that on the rocks. I like my bourbon nice and cool, and sometimes that little bit of dilution that you get really brings out different flavors in the bourbon that you're trying. You can try it in cocktails. Most popular cocktails are the Manhattan and the Old Fashioned. They're also very good with rye whiskey. Now, we're not talking about rye whiskey today, but what would you think the primary ingredient in a rye whiskey would be? Rice. Rye. Right? And so in the picture here, you've got an example of a Manhattan straight up. That means it's been shaken with ice, it's nice and cool, but it's placed in a nice cocktail. So there's an Old Fashioned, there's the Manhattan. Mint julep, also very popular in Kentucky, especially around Derby time. And the Sazerac. Now, the interesting thing about the Sazerac is a whiskey cocktail, but it requires the use of absinthe. And absinthe has been, had been outlawed for a really long time. Something about wormwood and hallucinations and green fairies, something along those lines. But it's now possible to get absinthe again, so the Sazerac has made a big return. In fact, it's one of my favorite cocktails. So, we had a famous author once say, "If I cannot drink bourbon and smoke cigars in heaven, then I shall not go." And as you go out into the world and everybody's drinking lots and lots of beer, I implore you to explore the world of America's Spirit bourbon. It is a fantastic thing. It has become my hobby. And yes, like I said, I have a presentation about it, but I really enjoy bourbon, talking about it, and enjoying it with friends. So thank you for your time. I appreciate your patience as I change the topic.